What is the role of courage in this whole crazy awakening process? This is something I don't talk about frequently, but I think it is an interesting topic. So, like many things, I would say as this process unfolds, this process of unbinding unfolds, courage means different things. So I might say that for the vast majority of people, for the world of mind identification, courage often, not always, but often means something like the ability to use your mind, to use your thoughts, to use your ideologies, to completely overlook what you're actually feeling, or even what the implications of what you're doing are. This means that the mind is very agile when it's in this state of stable disassociation called mind identification, also called the human condition. It's agile in that it's very easy to just rearrange thoughts, concepts, beliefs to conveniently use a certain way of thinking in a moment to overlook how we're feeling. So an example of that would be if you're doing something, let's say, uncomfortable, or you're engaged in something uncomfortable, an uncomfortable activity, an uncomfortable conversation, you'll often tell yourself, well, later on, this will pay off, right? The end will justify the means. So even though it's uncomfortable for me to do right now, I don't really have to think deeply into it or really consider what the situation is actually about or what my actions actually are, because later on, this will pay off for me, or it will come together, or will make sense later, right? This is very common. We do this all the time. So even in situations, and interestingly, in situations where the stakes are high, like physical risk is high to us, we can even use this escape mechanism of mind identification to avoid seeing clearly, feeling clearly what's actually going on inside us. So an example might be something like someone committing a crime, a theft or something along those lines, a burglary even. They are often telling themselves the story of what they're going to do with the merchandise, the money afterward, or the internal narrative of the persona that you want to believe in about yourself that gives you the strength or courage to commit that crime, for instance. So in extreme examples, this is how people are able to perpetuate widespread violence or harm, and that's through the use of ideologies. Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, used the example, and it's a good example of communism. By some estimates, Joseph Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 million people. There are different views on how many people were actually killed in the name of communism and that whole entire movement and all the decades that it played out. But clearly, a lot of people died for that ideology. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge was a similar example. So in the extreme, when there's massive emotional repression and there's a lot of fear, people can be moved to do extremely violent things, atrocious things, by using ideologies, by telling themselves the reason they're doing it matters, will pay off in the end. There are a lot of aspects to this. I'm not going to fully unpack it, but there are aspects that have to do with authority, using the mental construct of authority to give yourself permission to do things you wouldn't normally otherwise do. There are some classic social experiments or psychology experiments that demonstrate that people will do this. So I might call that level of functioning a sort of courage. Courage in the sense that You can steel yourself to the situation by using your mind and thus avoid what you're actually feeling. Now, obviously, there's a huge downside to this, as I described, and I purposely went into that in the wrong set of circumstances, that same mechanism that we might call courage in some circumstances ends up being very violent. So that level of courage is not deeply integrated, of course. It's not integrated at all. It's not good for you. It's not good for those you come in contact with, and not good for society as a whole. But interestingly, in this endeavor, in this undertaking we're talking about, it can be helpful at first to direct that seeking mind, the mind's ability to say later on when this will all pay off for me, to take that and turn it into a one-pointed questioning apparatus. Who am I? What is a thought? What is the nature of thought? What is the nature of consciousness? And then direct it toward its own source. Because that will, that personal will, that tendency to use the mind to overlook what's happening in the deeper places inside of you is an outgrowth of something. So you can investigate what it is an outgrowth of with the outgrowth itself, with the will itself. So we turn the will back into its own source and start to investigate deeply into this matter, the matter of birth and death, the matter of identity, the matter of what causes us to go unconscious. So we can utilize courage at that level. We utilize the mind and turn it into a precise tool to investigate its own nature. This is inquiry. This is how you use a koan, initially at least. When you start to ask yourself, what is mu? The first thing you'll do is start thinking about it. Because that's what's going to happen. That's what the mind does. The mind will view that as a mental puzzle, a cognitive process. And that's okay. It has to happen for a while. Now, it does go deeper. It will go beyond the level of mind, and that's the whole point. And when it drops completely beyond the level of mind, then something turns inside out. It feels like the whole universe turns inside out. What identity feels like, what you perceive as what's real and what's not real, just how it feels to be, how it feels to be alive, is completely, fundamentally altered. But it's not altered in a sort of lateral way. It's altered from something that feels small and discrete and suffering to something vast, indescribable, but intimate, clear, real. That's Kensho, Satori awakening. That's the opening. It's a big opening, but it really is the first step in a natural process of unbinding. Now with that, things look very different on the other side. For a while, you'll think you've eradicated all fear, repression, or you might not conclude that, but may feel quite like there's nothing like that there anymore. No pushing, pulling, no struggle. This is the honeymoon period. At some point, we start to feel these really intense, physical, energetic experiences, which can be confusing because it's so in contrast to what was realized. And what was realized hasn't gone away, but it's opened up this massive space, this capacity to start to process in a very direct way, in a way that's more direct than what you could have mustered before. These repressed emotional structures. So all the lost children start knocking at your door, the lost child of fear, the lost child of grief, the lost child of shame, the lost child of helplessness. But now it's different. In the world of mind identification, as I described, you can use the mind to just sort of sidestep this experience, to convince yourself of some other truth, some other reality in the mental space that conveniently pushes this aside or buries it again. All of a sudden, you can't do that, to your dismay. This is the one thing you sort of miss after awakening. You miss the ability to do that for a while. You realize it's completely absurd. It's nonsense. It never was helpful to you, even though you were kind of blissfully unaware in one sense. But if you're honest with yourself, you can see how that was there to help you go and remain unconscious, which you can't do now. Not nearly to the degree you could before. Will there be distractions still? Yes. Can you completely avoid these emotional structures? No, not anymore. So now there's a different kind of courage that comes online. The first kind of courage was bravado, was the sort of smug confidence of thought, of mind identification. The arrogance of the mind brings it about. But anyone who's deeply emotionally healthy, being around that knows it's not deeply authentic. It's not congruent. This is different. This is more of a shaky, vulnerable, fearful, surrendered courage. This is the courage of not BSing yourself anymore. This is the courage of being willing when you're not willing. This is the courage of finally seeing everything that's going on inside you, whether you want to or not. And is there still a choice here? Could argue both ways on that, but there are some circumstances, some people, situations, and even groups that will try to avoid this. They will turn spirituality into like another form of mind identification in a way. You could call it bypassing. And sometimes it's in the form of, well, there's no one to do this. There's no one to do the work. There's just pure awareness. That kind of thing has that flavor sometimes. Other times you may use group dynamics as a distraction to avoid this stuff. And in the extreme, that can become like a cult situation, which still happens, strangely enough. So those are the avoidant patterns. The avoidant patterns become more bizarre, actually, but they can happen. And everyone will have some avoidance, often through distraction and so forth. But it gets much more difficult here. And the deeper this goes, the more difficult it gets until you just finally are willing to really surrender to the process. So this is a very real kind of courage. This is a more mature courage. It's a more honest, congruent courage, because you know what there is to be afraid of here, because you can't separate yourself from it anymore. You see all those childhood fears, and now you come in direct contact with them, and you realize you built identities to avoid them instead of processing them. Trauma, a lot of traumas can come up here if there was a lot of childhood trauma and so forth. So getting help is sometimes prudent, whether it's through therapy or somatic work. I always recommend some kind of somatic work here, maybe TRE or something like that. Relational work can be helpful. Having a facilitator or a teacher who knows this territory can be helpful. And patience, and just a willingness to work in this space, to investigate, because you have to. You can't overlook this. The more you try to overlook it, the more it'll knock on your door until you just work through it and work with it and accept it and surrender to it. So this is the courage of contact, the courage of seeing everything, feeling everything, the courage of surrender. And that leads to this, maybe I could say a third kind of courage, which is absolute surrender. It's the courage to go completely beyond everything you know, all your own personal will, how you think this is supposed to go. It's the courage to let go of everything, even spirituality, your identity with spirituality, whether it's the type of spirituality, Buddhism or some sect of Buddhism, a certain teacher or teaching or style, or the way you use meditation to make yourself feel better. There are a lot of subtle identity structures that can hide here, but it's really the experience of being willing, to the degree you can, to let identity really deconstruct, to let it drop all the way. And in one sense, it's even more directly and energetically merged with the deep emotion body and the deep shadow, but it goes even beyond that. It becomes quite energetic. It's quite an energetic experience here. And it's difficult for me to even say what really makes the difference for someone who's going to go this way and be willing to go through, and those who will struggle with it, partially knowingly, often partially unknowingly. Yeah. So this is the courage of extinction, the courage of being willing to let all of it go, all of your paradigms, all of your beliefs. Really is about belief. What you're really letting go of is belief, but it can be surprising, very surprising, how deep belief goes and how much it feels familiar, like you, like what you want, like where you're going. All of that just starts to dissolve and you feel it, and it can be unsettling, but it's also natural. So in the end, courage is something like absolute, complete surrender, willingness to see a truth that is just completely beyond anything you can possibly imagine or understand. A living truth, certainly not a conceptual truth of any kind, but a physical experience of dissolution, of extinction. Another word for nirvana.